Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Who have I got next to me from the other side of the world? It is Will from Spacerex. That
Hello.
is right. And as you've probably seen from the title and the thumbnail, you'll never guess what we're going to talk about today. Will got in contact to say that he really wanted to come back onto the channel to talk about something specifically WDDA, no less, a hot topic at the moment. Will, why did you want to come back?
Because funny enough, when I was watching your last video on WDDA on Synology, it made the entire thing click for me. And I realized we have had a kind of core assumption about what WDDA is this entire time that I think is completely wrong. And I think it makes a lot of sense now why we've had some weird issues when it comes to what drives are compatible and everything like that. And I think it does not matter at all. And so I think the WDDA test is not actually what we originally thought it was. I think we probably need to go over what that test is first.
But yeah, that is bleak as hell. But real quick, for the people that are relatively new to this subject, which, let's face it, for your subscribers, my subscribers and regular watchers, is probably a bit redundant. So if you already know about it, fast forward about 2 minutes, guys. Real quick. So we recently, and fair play to it, Will was the first really to talk about this loudly online, although there was a few forums. Our friends over at Syno Forum, of course, were talking about it as well originally, with people posting about it, to do with how an on-board kind of management or health management tool on certain WD red drives was delivering a particular warning with regards to power on hours, and there are a few other things. I believe there are 18 different individual tests on board built into the WDDA, Western Digital Device Analytics, and this was pushing an alert from the drive onto the NAS system when the drive surpassed 3 years of power on time. This warning would then go to the system, which in some cases, depending on the OS that was being utilized and the system and whether it was enabled or not, more on that later on I'm sure, it would then deliver a warning on the storage system, that drive that was delivered to the end user, that effectively recommended or suggested, because that's going to be an interesting word for later, that drive needed to be replaced. And a lot of users did not like that, because when you dug down into the additional smart tests, the things we all use, that drive was perfectly healthy. Now, again, we could talk about the history of WDDA, where it started on surveillance drives, its original purpose, its integration. Again, I don't want to tread on Will's toes too much, so we'll save that for later on. But ultimately, that is where we are at. Synology, had it supported in DSM 7.0. They said as an option, something they then remove later on. There is still question marks floating around about how and where it's supported on QNAP. Again, sure, more on that later on, and other brands as well. But that's really where we are right now, and a lot of there's some finger pointing going on, and ultimately, if is there poo on everyone's shoes today? And why was the motivation? What was WD's motivation for doing this? So I think that's a fairly brief summary there. Why don't we add to that, Will? What have you got to tell us today?
So my big issue with the test is it really comes down to the fact that the uninformed user might actually think that is true. That is my core issue. Is as much as I would love it if 95% of NAS users watched channels like this and really kept up with it because it's a hobby of theirs and everything, I think it's probably flipped. I think probably 5% of NAS users actually go online and find this content interesting. The 95% probably just see it as an Office file server that stores their files and maybe their backups. And so it really comes down to, I feel like it was kind of predatory on the uninformed user saying, hey, you should look at replacing your drive. It's been 3 years and it's a test from WD that is coming out there and saying, hey, yeah, it's probably time to look at replacing your drive. That to me was predatory marketing because it's just not based on anything. It was not being flagged because it was actually had any smart tests that were actually showing a negative result. And I can go into this in a little bit. Funny enough, I actually filmed a video 2 months ago that's actually coming out now that actually goes over how to actually tell when a drive is dying, because there's some really good data that Backblaze publishes that will actually tell you what smart tests to look for and what attributes to look for when you're actually looking at a dying drive. And though the test did look at some of that, it did not look at the one that was getting flagged all the time was the one that was just from power on hours, and only 3 years. I could understand it if it was 7, but 3 years is just not a level that people should be replacing drives at. It is just not where
especially
drives should be
lasting.
Yeah.
On Pro drives, that is completely illogical, I think, for a lot of the time. And given the length of time these drives are going to be on, even Seagate, who, frankly, in the past has, dropped the ball a few times, let's be honest, when they've dropped the ball in the past, they've had Seagate Iron Wolf Health Management out for longer than 5 years. They, there was a time a lot of people would imagine that they would have had this power on thing there. So it's a surprise. Now, again, when I've chatted to Eddie about this, again, we made a video where me and Eddie have got very different opinions about this. An opinion, by the way, which has become even more split as time has worn on, by the way. And there is the counter argument that we own lots of appliances in our homes and business lives that, our cars that tell us how many miles that we've done, and devices that will tell you, maybe you should power this thing off after a short period of time. There is a validity, one might argue, that some devices, there is a benefit to saying this thing has been on for a given length of time, or maybe you should keep an eye on it or restart. But I don't believe this is one of them. I do not think a drive that is designed to be on 24/7, that has a 5-year warranty, some of which I have a drive in a QNAP 2 rooms from here, that is now coming up on 9 years old. And it's still running. I've never looked at the hours stat other than to boast. But sorry, carry on. Sorry.
Exactly, that's the thing. Drives last a very long time. And it's not like you should just go in and replace them every 3 years. It's just not something that's needed. If your data is that crucial, spend the money and have a high availability setup. That's going to cost you way less than replacing drives every 3 years. If you can keep your drives going for 8 years and have a high availability setup, boom, now you've got 2 NASs that are actually able to fail over rather than having to go through and replace drives every 3 years. That's what really, I know you can disable the test, and I know it's not enabled by default, but the part that really rubs you the wrong way is for the uninformed user, who's the majority of people, they see that as truth. When their drive tells them something that's a special test out of WDDA, they're going to listen to that. They're going to listen to that recommendation. And that's the core of my thing is people are going to enable this because they see it and they're like, okay, that is a drive-specific test.
Benefit.
It's going to know better than I do, when I don't believe it does. And
I think another element, one thing we've both talked about respectively is the fact that having the notifications from the drives itself is only half the story, because the device that it's in is the one that's going to be, recognizing this alert and acting upon it. And we found out through several occasions in the past and digging respectively that how that notification is translated actually differs from position to position, from NAS to NAS. I mean, again, WDDA actually started, from what I understand, for surveillance. It started as a surveillance add-on, which, and again, this is by no means saying I like the power on thing, because it really, really isn't. But the idea that it was originally developed, they say, alleged, etc., that the WDDA tool was utilised for surveillance systems, some of which did not have a GUI front end for managing surveillance, for managing drive health. These were devices from Hikvision, from Anymax, those sort of things, where the GUI of these devices had little or no time for drive health. They're all about camera stability, and storage was just a target. And in that arena, the ability to download this APK or whatever it was from WD's page to integrate drive health, I'm not going to say I like the power on thing, but there is a course where that could be legitimate. How this sits with utilising in a NAS, which already has a very robust GUI, already has a very robust health management tool built in with Smart, and the usability and access for that, it's a completely different utilisation of this service for me, and it completely undermines its utility at all.
Exactly. And the one thing that I think a lot of people have at the argument is, hey, at least give me the data, right? Like, give me the data out of the drive, because it is different than what the smart test is. I think that's probably the argument I've seen online, and I definitely get that. For the informed user who does their research and actually knows the stuff, yeah, they can see that test, and it's providing something that the smart test doesn't. Except it doesn't. So you actually tipped me off kind of in your last video, where you went through it and you're trying to figure out what drives had compatibility with WDDA, and you stuck a drive that had no compatibility on a Synology, and you stuck it in a QNAP and it did work. You were like, I have no idea, what's the list? These all must have the firmware. But then I realized, I don't think WDDA is a drive test at all. I don't think it has any custom code on the actual drive itself. As far as I can tell, WDDA is just a user interface for actual smart data. That's all it's taking in. It is literally just taking in smart data. And if you look at the actual values that it spits out, I've been able to track them to different smart values. So it actually does not bring any actual information to the table other than these warnings. Yeah, so WDDA appears to just read the smart data out of the actual drive and basically process it through its own statistical analysis and use that. The closest thing it actually does to actually doing any kind of math or anything is there are a few of the tests where it actually takes it reads the smart test every once in a while, the actual value out of it, and then divides that by the time in between. That's the closest thing to actual custom firmware that it does, other than just having a flag with raw smart values. And that is just where I don't see value in it, because the entire time, and I actually think I was the one who actually caused this issue, I thought it was a firmware test. That's where it was like, okay, it's only on specific drives, it came on this thing. It must be the fact that it was firmware locked where they were actually doing something. I don't even know if Iron Wolf Health Test actually has any firmware on the actual drive itself other than smart data. But if you look at the values out of it, every single one of these is just a smart value or a smart value divided by time. For anything that says rate over here, so for those of you who don't know, this is actually the back end of all the smart tests, all the WDDA tests. Anything that actually says rate here is just divided by time. And so the values out of here are nothing more than just basically a flag for when these values hit certain thresholds. And I've not been able to find those thresholds for anything other than the one that actually gets flagged every time, which is the power on hours alert. And the biggest issue I have with that is what everybody should be focusing on is essentially the key test. There are 5 key smart tests that actually tell you when a drive is dying. If you've not read this Backblaze article, I will send this over to Robbie and get him to edit it.
Linked in the description, yeah.
It is awesome. Backblaze has no money in the game. They're not trying to sell more hard drives. They're not trying to sell more NAS. They're not anything. They're a third party who is just there. This is basically just good PR for them, I guess, because what they do is they have, I think, tens of thousands of hard drives. 70,000 hard drives in their servers, and this is the data they publish. You can actually download all of their data on hard drive failures. Yeah. And you can actually download the raw values and do your own statistical analysis with. And every quarter, they publish these articles that say, hey, this is what we're checking to actually find when a drive is dying. So this is what should be something like a WDDA test, because it has true statistical showing on it. It actually has real basis and published. So,
I mean, again, I would add the caveat, again, with Backblaze, again, just in case people aren't aware, a lot of the time with Backblaze, the actual numbers of drives being tested aren't uniform and the lengths of time. So when you do get those quarterly reports, they are incredibly useful. But if you try to make comparisons between drives within Backblaze, you will occasionally hit problems where you're actually looking at a statistic based on 400 drives over 4 years versus 25 drives over 10 weeks. But when it comes to individual statistics within those, sodding valuable.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Like you can go too far on the edge. And one thing I do want to add in here is if you are using these tests are based off of a lot of different types of drives. But there's one key difference between the way that they run these tests and the way that regular NAS users might, is these hard drives for them never shut down. They shut down maybe 30 times in their entire life. So if you have something like a hibernation going on and the drives are spinning up and spinning down, your data may be different. So it may not be mapped one-to-one for you. There's just not statistical, it's not statistically sound because you have a different sample. But other than that, this is what should be really used for these kinds of things, because this is actually from a third-party unbiased source rather than Western Digital, who has just decided to come with their own metrics on here and not show us any reason why. So I just don't see reason, if it's not actually providing any special data out of the actual NAS or actually out of the NAS drives at all. I just don't see a place for it, because it is getting things there to sell more drives rather than to actually inform the user that there is an issue. That is kind of my stance on this. And I think they could have done a really good job. But I just see that the way they've set up today is focused more on selling drives than actually informing a user of when a drive is dying.
Just to play devil's advocate, because I think it, and again, to be frank, I agree with, I would say 99.99% of what you just said there, but to play devil's advocate, I would say with WDDA, if we were to try to go for the best case scenario, just to lay it all out there on the field. So let's say WDDA, it takes warnings that Smart would occasionally deliver in a clunky, not user-friendly fashion, and WDDA wraps them up in more user-friendly speak. Now, as I've heard that online said to me, and there is a little grain of truth in that. However,
absolutely,
as we've discussed before, NAS brands already have the means on their side to take the alerts that Smart is delivering and then package it in a user-friendly fashion. Be it Synology or QNAP, I have a 14 TB Seagate Barracuda that as of 2 weeks ago dropped in terms of its health, but I'm still using it for a couple of videos before I remove it out of my cycle. So at the moment, I didn't have time after Computex to swap that drive out for a new 14 TB. So this little Barracuda I'm running at the moment to do a video that I'm working on with NAS and non-NAS drives, because as things have moved on. So that drive is there, and I've had that drive in two different NASes in that time, and both of them have alerted me to the Smart test failure. The bad, I think, I'm not sure it's sector, it might just be just general spin. It's been too busy since all the years I've been using it. Those who watch the channel must have seen that drive a billion times. But still nonetheless, both QNAP and Synology that I've put it inside had their own tailored warning with different text both times. So the argument that the WDDA test is there to take Smart values and make them more palatable, I think then gets completely eradicated, again, because of a robust user interface and overall just presentation of how Smart and drive health is presented to the GUI. But I mean, why do you think NAS brands, again, such as QNAP, would roll in WDDA?
I mean, I see it as, like, looking at, I saw some Reddit posts from like 2 years ago where people were really excited for WDDA to come on for Synology. They were like, oh, what drives are going to support it? This is going to be great. This is going to be a useful tool. Because I think there was a kind of a core assumption that it was doing something that Smart was not. If you look at the site, the Western Digital site that actually goes over what WDDA is, it looks great. It is actually using historic information from different drives and being able to really give you a great understanding of what's going on with the drives. The thing is, I don't think everybody realized that they snuck in there. Oh, by the way, we're gonna say that the drive is looking like it should be probably replaced within the next because it's been 3 years old. That, I think, got lost. And I actually think what Synology did was, I think Synology implemented it in 2019. And then in 2022, that 3-year mark started hitting with drives. And you can look at Synology forums and bug reports, and people were sending in, hey, this drive is being flagged as warning because it's had too many power on hours. WDDA is saying, hey, there's an issue with this drive. Consider replacing it soon. So then Synology sees that, and I think that's actually the reason why they removed it in DSM 7, basically all the future models going through it after that. Actually, before my video and everything, it looks like Synology had actually removed the test outward going from now on, because I do think, in my opinion, WD did this in a somewhat predatory manner.
I mean, with regard to something you mentioned earlier on about this not being an on-drive thing, are you suggesting this, you believe this to be an actual an API or something that's built into the NAS software that is then triggered by the drive, or are you suggesting there is still something on the drive that has to make that connection? Because I will say I've tested a lot of WD drives in the last week or so, and I only found it to be activated on one drive I put inside. So again, I've not found multiple drives beyond an 8TB WD Red Pro drive, which was still not even on anyone's lists. That was the only drive I found which showed WDDA on board. So how does that align with your theory there?
Yeah, so I've not been able to validate this at all. But if we look at the warnings, every single one of those warnings is tied to a specific Smart value. And the way it looks to be implemented is it looks like basically it's just basically a little small snippet of code that WDA compiles and gives to Synology, QNAP, whoever, that actually basically has the actual code that interprets the Smart data. I think it literally is just handed Smart data of the drives maybe every minute or so. and then interprets it from there. So I don't think that this is using any specific firmware on the actual drives, though that has not been, I've not been able to check that at all. I wanted to go through, I just have not had time to mess with it and see if I could change the compatibility list within DSM to trick WDDA to start registering a Seagate drive, because I believe it should be true. If there is any specific firmware that's actually going on in the drive, it's not actually being shown to the end user at all. And another reason why I believe this is I have seen different lists with different error codes coming from different NAS manufacturers. So it looks like Synology and QNAP have essentially identical error codes. But if you look at, I found some Japanese NAS manufacturer who had been doing this longer, and they had a completely different ordered list with completely different error codes. And so I was like, why would that be? I assumed when I was going through this that the actual error codes, they were in hex, that they were actually coming directly out of the drive. But I actually believe it's the other way around. I think that it's basically just custom firmware for every single manufacturer that is just compiled and built in and interprets those results, not actually providing anything additionally. So that is what this entire thing hinges on. But if that's the case, I just don't see there's any reason to put it in there unless they are transparent about where they got the numbers from and why they're flagging things.
I mean, before I get to, I was going to question to ask you towards the end, but real quick, when you do mention about how these messages are displayed on each of the NAS brands, something that I found, and hopefully there'll be something on screen while I'm talking here, there was, what was really odd for me is, although the WD messaging from the breakdown of those 18 different variables, whether they are based on internal smart testing or unique, I think we are very much of the mind which one of those we think it is. With each of those, the brands themselves were the ones that were implementing those alerts. Now, as we mentioned, Synology have no longer got support with WDDA beyond DSM 7.0. They've clearly gone, nah, you're all right, to the whole thing, be it ours or not. And it is an option within QTS 5.1. But what's intriguing is the way the messages have been picked up. So, for example, QNAP, when it comes to the messaging, if you look in, they've literally just duped the original message. They've not altered it in any way from what I could see. There's, I think, the odd tense, perhaps.
But they're still calling it user should replace.
Those extra links. Yeah. I think there at the beginning, I'll have to double check that for all of the alerts. I was only really looking at the hours one. And Synology there was, he added the extra caveat, and they'd clearly gone to the top to change it around. So they'd seen the alerts, so they knew this was something that was being added in. But once again, to their credit, they looked at it and went, nah, you're all right, mate, and got shot. But again, there's poo on everybody's shoes on this one as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that this is included as an option within QTS, for me, I want to see what QNAP do in a reaction to this, because it should be added that it being on QTS 5.1, it is in their beta/release candidate stage. So there is the potential for it to not be there at all after the course of videos like yours and mine here. So again, I'm going to withhold just slightly longer judgment on them for that one. But for you, when it comes to WD, what do they need to do to win you back? What is it that they need to do for you to go, do you know what? We cool, bruh.
Yeah,
what they got to do?
I think that they actually have a really easy path here. I think what they should do is publish a white paper. Go through and say, hey, we have this many drives. Inform the users what to look for to tell when a drive is dying. They talk about on their site that it's based off historic data with tons of it. And so they had to get these figures from somewhere. Simply just publish a white paper. Say, hey, these are where all the figures come from. This is the probability of the drive dying. I mean, they could rip off Backblazes. And if they just take the Backblaze paper on what smart tests to look for and basically rewrite that to be what the WDDA test is and just go through and show their statistics on how they came up with these figures, that would be awesome. That way you can take, hey, when WDDA flags your drive as being powered on for 3 years, you can go to that paper and say, hey, this is my probability that my drive is going to fail in the next year. And be able to take that. Just that is where the drive data should come from. It should come from statistics, not marketing. That's my big thing is, if you look at failure rates, the 3-year mark is just a very strange place to put it until you realize that there's a 3-year warranty. So that is the biggest issue for me. And we also don't know what the rest of these thresholds are. I've not been able to find them. And so if they would just publish that, I would love it. It would be great. The user could actually go through and understand how their drive is going to live. And furthermore, they could take that exact same data and say, okay, I'm now informed. Now, I will say I would prefer them not to add in a time-based one unless they can show statistical relevance that says, after it's been powered on for 3 years, now your annualized failure goes over 5%. Having a threshold like that to actually get real values out would be much better, just because from reading Backblaze data, there's not a huge dip there. At least on the Backblaze side, drives are less likely to die at the 3-year mark than they are to die at the 1-year mark. So it's just a very weird place to put it.
See, for me, what I want to see is the narrative change, at least from WD the way it's being presented, because I'm very much still of the camp that a user should have access to as much information at their behest as they choose. And describing it as your drive has been on for 3 years worth of hours, have you considered getting a new drive, for me, is not a valid message. Had they said, for example, on a Plus series, WD Red Plus drive, your drive is now approaching the end of its warranty, but not as a warning or alert, that's cool. I like that. I want to know that. I've got a washing machine that does that. I'm cool with that, but I don't like this idea that under any context comes under the heading warning. That's not a warning. And for me, that was the real bugbear. Now, again, as you say, if it does turn out, and again, this is not me doubting you, but again, I've not had a chance to look at it myself, but if it does look like all of the other 17 other tests are purely based on smart data that has just been repackaged and recalculated, they are going to have to justify a lot of those, because unless they can justify it as this is to create a more palatable, easy to read version of those, and they can actually disprove that smart is overtly complex and a headache, fair enough, but they would have to prove that, white paper or otherwise, for me. But ultimately, the 3 years being described as anything other than your warranty is coming to an end, and again, let's not forget, they're putting it on bloody pro drives, then that's what it is for me. It's not. This hasn't, unlike yourself, it hasn't completely stopped me recommending WD drives to people, because sometimes for some users, WD Red drives are, if not the only option, there are good deals you see around. And what I do now is I recommend WD drives with caveats, which is pretty weak sauce sometimes, but I don't like to have to do that. But sometimes WD drives are the better option in some capacities and some price threshold points. But still, nonetheless, unless they're going to turn things around on this, much like SMR, this is a stain that's only going to get more sticky over time, and they're not going to be able to ditch it. And don't give it that much longer before NAS providers start turning their backs on this and start, who knows how long it'll be before a NAS brand goes and makes a press release that goes, "Oh, just to let you know, we don't actually do WDDA, peace out." Like that, when that becomes a press release, that's when you know you've done effed up,
Yeah.
But unless you've got anything that we've missed there, thank you so much for joining us on the channel today. Always a pleasure. But sorry,
Thank you. Yeah, completely agree with you. If the word warranty had been in there, completely different story. The single word of warranty added to that message would have changed the entire context, because then you actually understand. Completely agree with you. But yeah, I just really hope that they can go through and show this, because it is true. There are times where those drives are on sale, and they make good drives. They make good drives that last a long time. But having to say 80 caveats on any time you're purchasing a drive and wondering what might be down the line has not been actually found yet is just a sitting issue that I just cannot sit well with. My issue is more of they make good drives, but I will not be supporting the company until they can clear this up and actually kind of start treating their end users with, honestly, respect. Thank you for letting me invite myself on the channel.
Sorry, I've just got in, and because you obviously you people can hire you, they can utilize you for their own businesses. So when you form a relationship with an end user to sort out a solution for them, you're not just going to turn your back after 30 days, and the consequence is that 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the line, you might get a phone call from them. And the last thing you want when recommend a product to anyone is, one, having to give a bunch of caveats at the beginning, as you say, but also what you don't want is, and I said this to Tom at Lawrence Systems, what you don't want is 2 years down the line, suddenly, overnight, a firmware update, and boom, a bunch of other users have just contacted you to say, it's all melting, it's all going wrong. But Thank you so much for joining us again on the channel. It's fantastic to talk about this subject more and more. Who knows? We might not talk about this again. We bloody will, because WD, you've got to do something. But thank you so much for joining us on the channel today. Really great talking to you as always. Apart from that, thank you for watching, everyone. Resources and links to everything we talked about today from a multitude of different sites will be linked in the description. But other than that, have yourselves a fantastic week. Thanks again, Will, and we will see you next time.
Hey.